This is a podcast from the British Library. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.
Now, the conference is part of the public program of the coinciding with our current major exhibition, Buddhism, that some of you have visited yesterday. The lead curator, Jana Igumma, who is sitting here in the front row, Henry Ginsburg, curator of Thai, Lao, and Cambodian collections, is going to speak later today in a panel, and she will probably touch upon a few items that are also on display in the exhibition. As I said yesterday, we thought it was really important to have a conference that would focus on the very rich and diverse written heritage of the Buddhist world and its centrality in Buddhist practices. But we also wanted, being the British Library, to focus on collection-based research and bring together scholars, professionals, and practitioners who are working on texts and manuscripts from a variety of perspectives and using different approaches. And I think today you will see quite a few talks around issues of preservation, dissemination, and cataloging. For us, this is also a very good opportunity for a fruitful exchange with the wider community of Buddhist studies here in London, but also in the UK and beyond. And we are really pleased to have specialists and experts in Buddhist studies who have come here to be with us for the conference. We also want to show our work in the fields of digitization, conservation, and research, and how these activities are contributing to open up the extensive collection of Buddhist texts that we hold in our custodianship here at the British Library, and make collections accessible and searchable to all. This is really one of our key priorities. And of course, we are always looking into new ways of interpreting, studying, and promoting these collections. And therefore, exchanges, partnerships, dialogues like what this conference provides are absolutely essential. They're really vital for us to think about new ways of looking at collections. And of course, I would like to thank all staff from the British Library who have been involved in the organization of this conference, and particularly Matt Kimberley, who is here, researcher on the AHRC project Beyond Boundaries, who really led in the development of the program and the content of this conference, together with Sam Van Schaik, whom I will introduce in a minute. And of course, also my colleague Charles Manson, who works in the logistics and every single detail to make this conference happen. The conference is organized in partnership with the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Lucia Dolce, Numata Reader in Japanese Buddhism at SOAS, will speak later on. And it has been supported thanks to a generous grant from the Robert Ho Family Foundation. So we can now start with the first panel of day 2, which is on collections and Buddhist practices, art and performance. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Sam Van Schaik, who is the head of the Endangered Archives program here at the British Library. Sam worked for the International Tungkwan Project for several years here at the library, and he has been the co-investigator for several major research projects. The last one, the AHRC European Research Council project Beyond Boundaries, that looks at the transmission of Buddhism across Asia. He's the author of several publications, but the most recent one published last year is The Spirit of Zen 2019, and I understand that there is more in the pipeline coming up. So probably you should watch the work of Sam very closely in the coming few months. Okay, thank you, and please welcome Sam on stage.
Thank you, Louisa. So thank you for the kind introduction. So this morning, I'm just going to be hosting this panel. We'll have, as we did yesterday, 3 papers with questions saved for the end when the panelists will come back and sit here, and we'll have a general discussion about all of the papers. So if you have questions, save them for that point at the end. As Louisa said, this panel is about art and performance. So like all the panels in this conference, we're looking at collections and the role of manuscripts in collections. In this panel in particular, we're looking at how the fields of art history, the fields of kind of sociological study of the context of manuscripts and the practices around manuscripts all intersect with manuscript studies. I think all of the papers will touch on this in different ways. So we'll begin with a talk by Christian Luczanits, the David Snellgrove Senior Lecturer in Tibetan and Buddhist art at SOAS. Previously, he was a senior curator at the Rubin Museum in New York, so he also comes from a curatorial as well as an academic background. He works on Tibetan art, but he's also worked on Kushan period art from Gandhara and the region of the Kushan Empire. And recently he's worked on the art of Kashmir and Nepal in the 15th to 17th centuries. And since 2012, he's been working on a project based on the monasteries of Mustang in Nepal. And I think that will be the main material for his paper today. So please welcome Christian Luczanits.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be invited to this conference, which kind of gives me a chance to provide an overview of work that has been done in relation to a research project that now comes to an end and comes into a new phase, and I'm currently just conceiving where to proceed further. And this kind of will summarize what has been done so far, and also how texts have become a kind of major object of this study, even if it wasn't necessarily meant to be so from the very beginning. We'll go to Mustang, that is an area in western Nepal, a Tibetan cultural area that is essentially hidden behind 2 8,000 mountains, the Dhaulagiri and the Annapurna Massif, and it's probably the most direct route across the Himalayas, from the Tibetan plateau across the Himalayas to the Indian plains. And it's this fact that has helped for Mustang when it was a kind of unifiedly ruled kingdom, especially in the 15th and 16th century, to amass a huge amount of wealth. And what the project does is document part of what remains from that wealth. But times are changing rapidly. This is a picture from 2010, when the trekking path was largely intact. In the meantime, it has been destroyed by bulldozers, and you can see how broad the road is that is now being built. And it has become one of those major link roads to China, since there was only one link road after the blockage of the border on the southern side. The government essentially decided to open up several routes towards the north, and this is one of them. This is, of course, a major change to an area that originally is designated as, and still is designated as, a restricted area. And of course is famous for its capital, Luczanits, that we see here, that still kind of retains its 15th century city wall and two of the major temples inside. This brings us to the kind of non-portable heritage. And I'll just introduce four of the major monuments through two pictures each. One of them being Lurigomba, as representative of a number of caves in the region, which are extremely important, probably built in commemoration of a high Tibetan teacher. It's also the earliest kind of high-quality monument that is preserved in the region. And these are quite unique, with main stūpas in the center and the entire environment painted. From the Mustang kingdom, we have the two main temples in Luczanits, the Champalakhang, built between 1437 and 1448, which is a three-storied temple with an extremely rich pantheon, and Maitreya is the main image, which we see here. And the second one is the Tubchen Lakhang, which is even bigger, a few decades later, and was the main assembly hall, but also has suffered considerably in later history. And you can see that this wall is not original. It was originally, of course, this size, and so it's only partially preserved in its original conception. And it's massive. It's a gigantic monument that is really stunning within that environment. And I think that was, for me, when I came with knowledge of Ladakh and other Tibetan areas into Mustang, was the size of these buildings. And only then I realized how rich that area actually has been. And then I want to add a new monument that I contributed to in a publication with Charles Ramble and John Harrison, namely Gambagang in Lower Mustang, which is practically unknown, but is the most well-preserved Nyingma monument of the 17th century. And kind of highlights a second phase of fairly high donorship in the area. That is not only Nyingma, but also Sakya, which of course is inherited from the earlier period. This kind of following a first visit in 2010, I kind of was surprised by the high number of portable objects in the area that are readily on display, but photography of them was not allowed. And I particularly remembered the visit to Namgyal Monastery, which we see here, with all its sculptures on display, as well as a massive library left and right. And this monastery turned out to be kind of the first one that actually allowed me to do an inventory of their portable collection. So since 2013, I'm documenting there. And of course, inventories exist in Tibetan cultural heritage. They were in monastic organization. They do traditionally make inventories, and I once actually witnessed that in 1994 in Vandla, when these two gentlemen came to a subsidiary monastery of Lamayuru to check if all the things are still there. And these are just handwritten lists that just list maybe the deity, maybe the donor, but no other information about it. But then I go to details like the number of butter lamps and so on. They are renewed either yearly or when the key holdership changes from one person to another to check if all the items are still there. And so in a way, the work that we do adds to that first measurements and then photographic documentation, because both don't exist. And obviously these descriptions are never enough to actually identify the figure. You could easily change one Shakyamuni Buddha with a new Shakyamuni Buddha. It doesn't really, it's not a problem in that sense. And yeah, the documentation is very comprehensive. It kind of takes sculptures, for example, from all sides. Initially, books were taken as objects, so with covers, manuscripts, and as separate objects joined, because as it turns out, in most cases, they didn't belong together originally. And from 2016 to this, or next month actually, this happens within the framework of this project, an AHRC funded research project on Tibetan Buddhist monastery collections today. These are the monuments that we have documented so far, and this gives you an idea about the numbers. About 2,000 objects and 44,000 photographs of, 44,000 photographs of manuscripts, which is of course an enormous amount and is mostly due to the library of Namgyal Monastery, which turned out to be extremely important. The background for this is, of course, that the images preserved in Mustang are what would be considered the highest quality of Tibetan art preserved. An image like this would make around, I think the minimum price would be $500,000 on the Western market, very easily, probably with the more recent price increases, this would even be higher. But getting access to these collections is extremely difficult, simply because originally photography has been used to commission thefts. And this happened throughout the Himalayas, that people who know would photograph something and say, I'll give you $10,000 if you bring me that object. And these thefts happened in all areas of the Himalayas, with the result that objects are hidden away. In Mustang, they were less hidden, or in Lower Mustang, they were, Upper Mustang less so, because it's simply not as overrun. But they were very strict in terms of photography, so they didn't allow any photography. Yeah? Which of course meant also that they had no documentation in the case of a theft anyway. Yeah, so they couldn't prove anymore that they actually had that object. And you see some Mustang abbots will tell you that this object is in the Rubin Museum today, but they have no way of proving that. But they may have kind of a recognition that they have, or a remembrance that they had that. And so what the documentation provides is the proof of ownership through the photographic documentation. And you need to do that. And that, of course, was the biggest kind of effort to get that notion through. The other thing that the project essentially contributes is that will give them more or less an idea what they have, because very often they don't know what they have. And I have one wonderful example that in the midst of this museum display, there is, for example, an 8th century stūpa that, of course, they didn't think it's especially valuable, simply because, you know, you hardly see what it is through to the assemblage of grime, essentially, on the object. So next I'll just give you an idea what we'll have found so far, and it's more or less in chronological order, and it's actually quite spectacular. Sets in general are interesting, so you actually, instead of having one of them in 3 different museums, you actually have all of them who belong together as a set in one place. These are 11th century Kashmiri sculptures. The earliest book illuminations are probably from the 12th century. And as Marta Zanesi has found out, we also have one of the earliest prints in Tibetan script at all, which is a Yuan period text that was printed in Beijing in 1299, also a volume that is not or has not been recorded before. Then we have this sutra collection, essentially the earliest illuminated sutra collection. That means a collection that has an iconographic program across 30 volumes with at least 4 illuminations each on the front and the back page. And I'm currently studying this in detail with Markus Fiebeck, and the hand list of that sutra collection is already available on the Kanjo and Danjo website in Vienna. We have several Lamdre lineages, which is the kind of succession of teachers that transmitted the Lamdre teachings within the Sakya school that are inscribed by different donors, like this set of Lodo Gyaltsen, late 15th century, remarkable sets of 8 stūpas. Almost every monastery has one, and some really exceptional pieces in terms of the workmanship. Like if you look at this, the way the inlay is done, the copper and silver inlay on this, as if it would have been drawn, I haven't seen that anywhere else in that form. And of course, once we started to also look at the books, essentially, yeah, I would say 80% of the larger format books have some form of art attached to it, be it in covers, be it in painted covers, or be it in the manuscript itself through illuminations. We also found 2 scrolls that were apparently used to surround mandalas at ritual and represent the circle of flames around, and motifs that are immediately suitable for that periphery. But even from the 17th century, we have major... Did the microphone go off, or is it okay? Even from the 17th century, we have kind of major sculptures, like I love these clay sculptures of the Guru Tsengye, the 8 manifestations of Padmasambhava in Logekar, or just photographed this year, wonderful kind of bronze and repoussé work from Dzong Monastery. But I think the most surprising for me were the symbols, because symbols, as difficult they are to date art historically, each of them has a story attached to them and a special usage. And this is something I want to keep up and learn further about, because it's very important to preserve as well in a catalog of the inventory what the story is associated with those objects. The kind of a lot of the information that we get from these objects, of course, pertains to local history, and I'll just give a few ideas of surprising kind of facts that come from this. One surprising one is that this particular set of Lamdre teachers actually distinguishes the Indian teachers from the Tibetan teachers by the metal alloy. And so if we would not have seen them on one site, we would not be able to say that this is the same set. We would simply assume these are from 2 different sets, one made in copper, one made in a lighter material. Yeah? And so that was a major surprise. Of course, then there are many objects that wouldn't go on the market necessarily, but are still very high quality artworks, like sculptures in papier-mâché. And then the most exciting part that only slowly comes to the fore is the interlinkage that can be made between objects from different places. And I'll just show you one example that was surprising. In Geling, we found this Lama Bünzok Tsukyen Norbu tanka with a Drukpa teacher above. So a Sakya teacher who comes from the royal house with a Drukpa Lama as his root guru. And then we found several representations of this root guru inscribed or not inscribed. And it's the inscribed objects, of course, that help us to identify these persons across monasteries as well as across wall paintings. So it's really, the hope is that the more information we have of the corpus of the different monasteries, the more we will be able to actually identify more precisely where they come from and whom they represent. The project had an interesting impact so far. One of the more surprising, again, is that it connects the monks, or especially the abbots that worked with us, back to their heritage, because they suddenly are much more aware of what they actually have. And sometimes can even identify themselves with it as saying, like, this donor is considered part of my ancestors. Yeah, and things like this happen. I think it also helps to make them a little bit more careful in their management and handling of the objects. I'm not sure if you have ever seen the original way of doing things. These are, of course, the Gonya, the key holder, is usually a person who has no special education. He has to do that for 2 years, and his main task is doing the rituals. But when they tell him to move an object, he has to move an object, but he doesn't get trained in it. And this would be something that my project, or a future iteration of that project, will probably try to change. They also ask us if they want to clean the sculptures, how to do it best. This is after cleaning. His hair was completely black. We didn't even see that he had his hair made in silver. Or sometimes more recently about the display. So they had additional, how can you kind of transform a traditional display that makes it a little bit more accessible. And Chiara Bellini and Luis Didacott have also created a little catalog for a brochure for that can be given to tourists interested in what they see to look at that. As one can gather, this is extremely rich heritage, even if it's only fragments what it is there today in relation to what must have been there originally. What I hope the project will help is enabling to redisplay objects that weren't shown in between, hidden away in boxes like this one's from Gami Monastery. Books have become a huge part of the project, a very labor-intensive part. You have to imagine I'm probably maximum there 3 weeks a year. And in Upper Mustang, it's $50 a day. So it's relatively limited what you can do in those short time spans. But they need a continuous effort because I think there is a lot to discover still. And also among the prints that I didn't, or that only partially paid real attention to. And then there is a kind of becoming an effort to create museums throughout the area. So it's a kind of, as a question of security, and of course the big model is Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, which created a major museum. And for me, my main goal would, of course, to make it accessible online internationally. So the museums make it available both locally for tourists, but when I go there and ask for permission to document, I do not ask that, because I would not be allowed to document. And that's one of the reasons why I can't ask the Endangered Manuscript Project for funding. Because, there is a kind of certain distrust once you publish the photo that it endangers the preservation of the heritage. And it's very hard to convince that actually the more public it is, the more difficult it is to sell. And the least interesting it is to actually acquire it in some kind of illegal way. And then there are major collections that I haven't looked at because I didn't get access yet, which is, for example, Tsarang Monastery and Chöde Monastery in Mustang. So there is a lot to look forward to in future work. Thank you.
You've been listening to a British Library podcast. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.